Students often tell me that part 3 of the IELTS speaking test is the most difficult. And why? Because they don't know what to say. The questions can be so unpredictable. Unlike part 1 and 2, it's actually a discussion. It's not a question and answer thing. If you want to get higher marks, it's essential that you do well in part 3. So you need to rise in part 3, not fall. In this part of the test, the examiner can ask you anything he wants to ask you as long as it's related to the topic. Part 3 is actually a distinct, gradual, step-by-step process of different questions becoming more difficult as they go along. And so let's look at what these kind of questions are and how they begin and how they lead to the most difficult questions at the end of the conversation. So I'm going to show you 5 types of questions that are usually asked in the part 3. They're usually in this order, but sometimes the examiner changes the order of these questions depending on what he thinks about your English. If he thinks you're very good, he might ask you the more difficult questions quite quickly. But this is the standard order of the kind of questions he's going to ask you. It usually begins with a general opening question, just to get the conversation started. And then if you don't expand on these ideas that you give him, then he'll ask you to do so. So he'll ask you to expand and explain what you're talking about. That's the second type. And then with the next question, he often tries to introduce some complexity to his questions, hoping that you are able to respond. After that, he will ask you some hypothetical questions or speculative questions because they are a little bit more difficult, and so he's testing you to see, can you talk about more difficult topics? And the fifth kind of question usually concerns wider implications of your discussion or philosophical reflection. And if he asks you these kind of questions, it's usually because he thinks you may be able to answer them, and he wants to see if you can. If you can, you're telling him you've got quite a good level of English. So these are the 5 types of questions, and within those, he can phrase them any way he wants, and he can ask anything with using these types of questions. So these general opening questions first are to get the conversation started, and they usually ask for a candidate's opinion on the topic. So here's some examples of general opening questions in part 3 of the test. So you're talking about travel. Why do you think people like to travel to new places? So that's a general open question to get things going. Or education. What makes a good education system, in your opinion? Starting to get your opinion, to get things started. And technology. Do you think technology has improved our lives overall? Big open question, and it's inviting you to come in with some ideas, right? So that gets the conversation or the discussion started, and they should be the easiest ones, again, because they're asking your opinion. The second type of question, therefore, asks you to expand on what you just said. Tell me more on what you just said. Now, he may not ask these questions if, for example, you have already expanded on your answers, then he will miss this and go to the third kind of question. So he may ask you things like, why do you think that? Can you give me an example? And as you should know by now, you should be doing this anyway. So you should be explaining why when you say something. You should be given an example when you say something. But if you don't, he's going to ask you and try to move the conversation along with finding out more details from you. Some examples. Again, we look at traveling. So what are some of the reasons people might prefer traveling abroad to staying in their own country? Reasons. Asking why would they do this? Again, education. Why do you think some people believe that schools focus too much on exams? Okay, we're getting a little bit more exact with these questions, and they're asking you why. Give me reasons. Come on, give me reasons, examples. Technology. Can you explain how technology has impacted personal relationships? Again, want reasons why and examples, but this time the topic's getting a bit more exact, a bit more precise of what you're talking about now. So that's tell me more or expanding on ideas. So the third type of question is introducing complexity. Now, this part usually is where the examiner can see if you're able to talk deeper, or most of your English is on the surface and you cannot express ideas below that. So this is called introducing complexity. I like to call it think critically. Can you think critically? And can you express that thinking in words? And this in university, for example, is called evaluate or think critically or even compare. That would be a simpler word. So other words for think critically, you could say, can you compare? Can you contrast? Can you evaluate? Possibly analyze? Here's some examples. So again, on education, do you think children learn more from their teachers or their parents? And why? More education? How do you think modern education is different from education in the past? What about technology? Are there any disadvantages to relying heavily on technology in daily life? So this time they're asking you to be more specific and to think a little more complex, to think under the surface a little bit. So how do you think modern education is different from education in the past? For example, perhaps you don't know much about the past education, but you've got to start thinking about this critically and fast. So the next set of questions, it may depend on how he thinks you answered those third questions there when you started to think critically. If he didn't think you can go further than this, he may not ask you these questions, but it's a good sign if he does ask you these questions because he thinks maybe it's possible, and that means your English is going to be a higher mark. So let's see. So the fourth kind of question I like to call what if. That's the very simple way of doing it. And these are hypothetical questions, perhaps, that ask you to speculate about things that have never happened, maybe not even possible. What if questions. So in general English, they can be very silly sounding questions, strange sounding questions, because they're asking you to imagine things that have not happened and may not. So, for example, what if you were a banana? So that seems a ridiculous question, but it's people playing with ideas and asking you to speculate and use your imagination is the big thing. So you need a bit of imagination, especially for this. They might ask you in general English, if you were me, what would you do? So you can see it uses conditional sentences often to ask the questions. You can use them in the answer and use other grammar also. Or would the world be a better place if everyone thought and did the same thing? Now, this does not happen at the moment, and hopefully it's never going to happen, but you have to use your imagination to imagine it and then express your ideas verbally. So these, as I said, called speculative or hypothetical questions. What it means is imagine this. So this is assessing your ability to think and express ideas or abstract ideas. Of course, you can use conditional language because it's a big opportunity for this. Examples, traveling. What might happen if people stopped traveling altogether? Education. How do you think education will change in the next 20 years? Or technology. What would life be like without any modern technology? So you have to use your imagination, you have to use it quickly and then express some of these ideas. And what he's looking for are some different ideas from below the surface or anything like that, not surface nice ideas. He wants depth to your talk. Now, if you can give deeper, more thoughtful ideas and express them, this is very good. And this is why he's asking you the question, because he wants you to be able to do this. If you can do it even a little bit, your mark will go up. And then we have the last kinds of questions that he may ask you. It depends, as I said, if the examiner thinks you're very good at the beginning of the discussion, he may jump to such questions immediately. If he's not sure, he'll build to them. They could be the last ones, but they're often the more difficult questions because they are the deeper questions of all the discussion. So these are wider implication or philosophical ideas in these questions. And they really mean, is it all really so simple? So let's see. These are the surprising questions. These are sometimes the questions that students find unexpected. These are often the questions that the examiner did not know he was going to ask until he started talking to you. So sometimes these questions sound strange. They can sound strange because occasionally when the examiner asks you, he does not phrase the question very well because he's just thought of the idea himself. However, what are these ideas about? Where do these ideas come from for these questions? Because these are the most unexpected ones. So we're going to look at that, but first let's summarize and give special names to all of these questions. So the first general open questions we'll think of as let's get started. The next ones where we expand on ideas and give examples and explanation, we'll call these questions tell me more. And these are probably the two most simple kinds. And then the third questions, we'll call them think critically, where you try to think critically a little deeper, a little more complex, and express them in English. And then the last two are the more difficult ones. So imagine, that's hypothetical questions where you have to start thinking about abstract ideas and then express what you think about them. And the most surprising, the last two, imagine, and this one, can be more surprising and unexpected, and therefore the scariest in the part 3 discussion. The last one, we'll call it, is it really so simple? So we've got 5 kinds of questions. I think the first 2 are probably the simple ones that get you going. And then they start to get a bit scarier, a bit more difficult and a bit more challenging. But you know why they're asking these, because they want to see, can you do it, so they can give you a higher mark. But they're not so unpredictable. So these are the 2 most challenging. Imagine, the hypothetical questions, and is it really so simple? Could be philosophical or wider implication. But as I said, you can still predict the kind of question, not the way the examiner phrases it, but the kind of question he's going to ask, if you know what these questions are basically asking for, where they come from, these questions. So remember, when you answer all of these questions when you're speaking, it's always good to explain, and explain without him or the examiner asking you to explain. And it's also good to give examples without the examiner asking you for them. And this means you talk longer and possibly more fluently, but you don't want the examiner asking you lots and lots of questions. So this, of course, gives you more speaking time. All right, let's look at some of the questions on different topics, just to give you an idea of how they might come about in the speaking. Now, remember, these questions are not written down in the book for the examiner to ask you. They're the kind of questions he or she may ask you these questions while you're talking. For example, you're talking and he starts to think of this question, then he asks you. So it's these kind of things. So in technology, let's look at a couple of hypothetical questions, imaginary questions. So if artificial intelligence could completely replace human workers, how do you think society would function? Other one, imagine a future where people can upload their minds into computers. Would this be a good or a bad development? Now let's look at the wider philosophical kind of question. Do you think technology brings people closer together or pushes them further apart? Should there be limits on technological advancements, or should innovation be unrestricted? And you may also notice that the vocabulary is a bit stronger in these questions also. Here's some about work, hypothetical questions. If people only worked 4 days a week instead of 5, do you think they would be happier and more productive? If robots took over most jobs, do you think people would find new ways to contribute to society? The wider philosophical questions. Is job satisfaction more important than a high salary, for example? And this could come from the idea, is it better to be happy with no money or have lots of money and not be happy, for example? It's a kind of philosophical idea. We'll look at the topic of cities, hypothetical. If all cities were car-free, how would urban life change? If everyone moved to cities, what impact would it have on rural areas? The wider philosophical questions: does living in a city improve a person's quality of life? Is it natural for human beings to live in big cities? Should governments control urban expansion, or should cities grow naturally? What about history? Hypothetical questions. If all historical records were erased, how would people learn from the past? Why do some governments do this? If you could go back in time and change one historical event, what would it be and why? Philosophical. Do you think history is written from a biased perspective? If every country has a different view of history, is history ever true? Is it important to preserve historical buildings, even if they're expensive to maintain? So these are the kind of questions, and they're the more difficult questions, and they're looking for more thoughtful answers. But these are the kind of questions that may surprise a student in part 3 of the exam. But they shouldn't be too surprising if you think about them beforehand. And one way of thinking about such questions beforehand is to understand the basic questions, that where these questions actually come from. So yes, they come from the head of the examiner, but often this head is programmed by how they were brought up, their culture, etc., lots of things. So a good idea is to look at some of the concepts that these questions are based on. So here are some of the concepts that I'll quickly show you that are the base of a lot of these, especially these philosophical questions at the end. So the idea of ethics and morality, and particularly morality is a subject that's very commonly discussed in the West. So example, should athletes who use performance-enhancing drugs be banned permanently? Should companies be forced to adopt eco-friendly policies? All about ethics and morality. Is it ethical for celebrities to promote unhealthy products? Now, usually their ethics and morality are quite similar. Ethics is usually a set of guidelines for a business or for a government telling people as a guide how they must behave. And morality is a personal thing, right and wrong, etc. Also, they're based on the idea of freedom and responsibility, the discussion about freedom and responsibility. So, for example, freedom of speech versus censorship. So the balance between free expression and controlling what some people call harmful content. But again, who calls what harmful? Example, should social media platforms regulate what people post? So while freedom of speech is important, some regulation is necessary to prevent misinformation and hate speech. Do you agree with that? Personal responsibility versus government intervention. So how much individuals should be responsible for their own actions against how much government should control them? So what's your opinion? Can you discuss this deeper idea? Also, we have the concept of individualism versus collectivism. So individual rights versus social responsibility. That's often the basis of a lot of these questions in part 3. So the extent to which personal freedoms should be restricted for the benefit of society or the people who run society. And this includes meritocracy versus equality. So whether success should be based purely on ability, merit, or if there should be policies to ensure fairness, equality. Here's an example question for universities. Should universities have quotas for disadvantaged students? And reality and perception. Again, this is very commonly the base of a lot of questions in part 3, the philosophical ones. Objective versus subjective truth. So the debate over whether truth is absolute for everywhere and everybody, or it depends on perspective. And this can also include ideas such as social constructivism, the idea that many aspects of reality are shaped by society rather than being natural facts. What do you think about that, for example? So, example question, is the idea of success different in different countries? And of course, you have justice versus fairness. Here's some example. Should the rich be taxed more than the poor? Or should criminals be given a second or a third or a fourth chance? Technology and progress is also a big conversation point. Example, is artificial intelligence making human workers obsolete? Or should AI be given rights if it becomes self-aware? And then you have questions about aesthetics and art. That's about objective beauty and subjective taste. So whether beauty is a universal concept, everyone agrees what beauty is, or it depends on individual perspective. And often in these discussions, you have the discussion about fake or art for social change. So whether art should exist purely for beauty or should have a deeper kind of meaning. So you should think about some of these concepts because these concepts come up in many different topics in part 3. And usually as I said, if you're asked these questions and you have the ability to answer just a little bit, that's a big improvement for your score. So these philosophical ideas in particular make your answers more developed and analytical, and you don't usually get these ideas expressed, for example, with a 6. That's usually slightly higher. So step 1, you should identify what that underlying concept is in the question. When you're asked a question, you should think about what's that basically about, one of these ideas. You should always give a relevant explanation and relevant example. Okay, so remember, for the examiner, the follow-up questions can often depend on that particular examiner's point of view. So one examiner may think a certain way, so he or she asks you a specific kind of question. Me, for example, I might think a different way and ask you a different kind of question, but they're usually based on these basic ideas. So this question, as I gave you earlier, the answer was, well, freedom of speech is important. Some regulation is necessary to prevent misinformation and hate speech. Now, if someone said that to me, I would immediately then ask them, what exactly is hate speech and who decides? Another examiner may not ask anything. And also, I might ask you this question. Don't governments produce more misinformation than the general public? Now, you can think anything you want as long as you are able to discuss something like this. We're not on a surface discussion. We're deeper, and that's good for you, no matter what opinion you have. So you should also keep these ideas in mind for task 2 of the writing, because if you're able to express these deeper ideas in your writing, it will get you a higher mark. And of course, I have a video already posted about writing task 2, so you should click on the link for that video after this one. So probably you found these kind of questions, particularly the last few questions in the philosophical ideas, quite difficult and quite scary, perhaps. So if you have any that you would like me to expand upon or give you more ideas for, please leave comments below. In the near future, I'm going to be making videos with possible answers for these more difficult questions. All right, see you next time.